When I walked out onto my porch at 5:45 in the morning and saw a fresh pile of dog waste smeared right across the driver's side windshield of my truck for the fourth time in a month, I didn't scream, I didn't swear, I just stood there in my bathrobe, holding a lukewarm mug of black coffee, and felt this strange, cold clarity wash over me. It was a humid morning in a suburb outside of Austin, the kind where the air feels like a wet blanket, and, as the smell of that, gift, hit me, I realized that my HOA president, a woman named Beverly Vance, hadn't just declared war, she had decided that I didn't and oppose. T deserved to exist in my own home. You see, I'm a guy who lives by blueprints and structural integrity. I've spent 25 years as a forensic structural engineer, which basically means I get paid to find out exactly why things fall apart. And looking at that windshield, I knew Beverly's little empire was about to experience a catastrophic failure. This all started because of a driveway, or more specifically, the fact that Beverly decided my driveway was her personal overflow parking for a pristine, white Mercedes SUV. Now, Beverly is one of those women who wears tennis whites to go to the mailbox and speaks in a tone of voice that suggests she's doing you a massive favor just by breathing the same oxygen. And when I first moved into, the Willows, 6 months ago, I tried to be the, good neighbor, type. I just come out of a pretty messy divorce. I was trying to build a stable spot for my teenage son, Leo, to spend his weekends, and I really just wanted to fly under the radar. So the first time I found her car blocking my garage, I walked over to her place, this massive, white-pillared house on the corner, and politely asked if she could move it. She didn't oppose. To even look me in the eye, she just waved a manicured hand and said, "Oh, I'm sure you don't mind, dear, just for a few hours while I host the beautification committee," And that was it. No apology, no acknowledgement that she was literally trapping my vehicle inside my own property. The thing about people like Beverly is that they mistake patience for weakness. And because I didn't and oppose, to make a scene that first day, she felt entitled to do it again, and suddenly it was a daily occurrence where I'd have to trek through my own lawn, ruining my work shoes in the mud, just to get to the street because she'd parked so close to my garage door that the sensors wouldn't and oppose to even let it open. It sounds small, right? A parking dispute? But it's the crunch, of your own gravel under your feet as you're forced to bypass your own home that starts to eat at you. It's the look on your kid's face when he asks why that lady is allowed to use our house like a parking lot. And it's the realization that everyone else in the neighborhood is watching from behind their curtains, terrified of the woman who holds the power to find them into bankruptcy. I tried the official route, I really did. I sent a formal letter to the HOA board, only to find out that Beverly is the board, or at least she's the one who pulls the strings of the 3 other retired puppets who sit on it. And the response I got back wasn't and oppose. An apology? It was a violation notice. $700 in fines for, non-compliant landscaping, because I had a small bird feeder in the backyard that apparently, attracted nuisance wildlife, and a warning that my, aggressive tone, toward board members would not be tolerated. That was the moment I realized I wasn't and oppose. Dealing with a neighbor, I was dealing with a tyrant who used her position to curate the neighborhood like a dollhouse, and I was the one toy that didn't and oppose. Fit the aesthetic. But here's the thing Beverly didn't and oppose. Account for. An engineer's brain doesn't and oppose. Stop working when the clock hits 5 p.m., and if you give me a problem, I'm going to find a structural flaw. I started spending my evenings in my garage, but I wasn't in oppose. Working on my truck, I was digging through the county's digital archives, pulling the original plat maps from 1994 when this development was first carved out of the Texas brush. I spent hours cross-referencing property lines with tax assessments, and that's when I met Mrs. Gable, a 78-year-old widow who lives 2 doors down and has the kind of sharp, observant eyes that see everything but say nothing. She saw me out there with a transit level and a measuring tape one Saturday, and she just leaned over her fence and whispered, she did the same thing to the Millers. They moved out last year, lost $40,000 on the sale just to get away from her. That hit me like a ton of bricks. Beverly wasn't an oppose. Just being Karen, she was systematically driving people out. And when I asked Mrs. Gable who handled the Millers and oppose real estate listing, she gave me a knowing look and said, Beverly Vance Realty, of course. She's the only one who in Oppos understands in Oppos, the neighborhood in Oppos, S value. End quote. The pieces started clicking together in this really ugly way. It was a predatory cycle of harassment, forced sales, and commission checks. But I needed more than a theory, I needed data. I installed a high-definition, motion-activated camera hidden inside a birdhouse. And for 2 weeks, I watched the, end quote, Beverly show, end quote, in 4K. I saw her walking her golden retriever at 3 a.m., letting it do its business on my prize-winning hydrangeas while she took notes on a clipboard. I saw her measuring the height of my grass with a literal ruler. And most importantly, I captured the exact moment she started, end quote, decorating, end quote, my windshield. But the real, end quote, aha, end quote, moment came from the dirt, literally. When I was surveying my property line to figure out where I could legally install a fence, I noticed that the corner markers for Beverly's lot had been moved, and I'm not talking about a few inches, I'm talking about 10 feet of what should have been common area and part of my easement being absorbed into her, end quote, circular, end quote, driveway. I went back to the tax records, and my jaw nearly hit the floor. Beverly had been paying property taxes on a lot size that was significantly smaller than what she was actually occupying. She had basically annexed a portion of the neighborhood's land and my driveway's apron to make her estate look more grand, and she'd been doing it for years. So I decided to play her game, but with a lot more electricity involved. I didn't in Oppos call the police yet because I knew the, end quote, civil matter, end quote, excuse would just give her time to cover her tracks. Instead, I went to a commercial security firm and I ordered a heavy-duty, industrial-grade automatic boom gate, the kind you see at high-security parking garages or gated estates, and I had it delivered to my office, so she wooed into Oppos, TC the crate. While I waited for the installation date, I set up my, end quote, level 1, end quote, defense, which was a simple modification to my smart irrigation system. I moved one high-pressure sprinkler head to the very edge of my property, right where the driver's side door of a Mercedes would sit when she parked in my driveway, and I programmed it for a, end quote, cleaning cycle, end quote, at 6:15 a.m. The first morning it hit, I was sitting in my darkened kitchen, sipping my coffee, and I heard the, end quote, whoosh thwack, end quote, of the water hitting metal, followed by a scream that sounded like a banshee with a stub toe. Beverly had stepped out of her car, dressed for a morning gala or whatever she does, and got absolutely leveled by a concentrated stream of recycled gray water. She marched to my door, dripping wet and purple with rage, screaming about, end quote, malicious intent, end quote, and I just opened the door in my pajamas, looking as sleepy as possible, and said, end quote, oh, sorry, Beverly, the system's been glitchy lately. I've been trying to fix it, but I can't get my truck out to go to the hardware store because someone keeps blocking my garage. You wooed into Oppos. Do you happen to know who that is? Would you? End quote. The look on her face was pure, unadulterated venom, and I knew the, end quote, gloves off, end quote, phase had begun. She retaliated by calling an, end quote, emergency, end quote, HOA meeting to discuss, end quote, architectural purity, end quote, which was really just a platform for her to try and pass a rule banning any, end quote, obstructive barriers, end quote, on driveways, but she didn't in Oppos. T realized I'd been busy in the neighborhood group chat. I've been sending the footage of her late night, end quote, patrols, end quote, to the other neighbors, showing them exactly what she was doing when she thought nobody was looking, and the atmosphere in that community center was thick with a tension I'd never felt before. Beverly stood up there with her PowerPoint, looking every bit the queen bee, until I raised my hand and asked, end quote, Beverly, before we talk about gates, can we talk about Section 4.2 of the County Tax Code regarding an Oppos, unauthorized land annexation in Oppos, end quote. The room went so quiet you could hear the air conditioning hum. Her face went from pale to a dusty rose, and she tried to shut me down, saying I was out of order, but I just kept going. I pulled out the plat maps. I showed the discrepancies in her lot size, and intoned, very casually, that the county assessor might be interested in why her, end quote, circular driveway, end quote, was sitting on 3,000 square feet of land she wasn't in Oppos, paying taxes on. She ended the meeting right there, but the damage was done. The, end quote, puppet board, end quote, saw the writing on the wall, and they realized that if Beverly went down for fraud, they were going with her for negligence. That Saturday was, end quote, gate day, end quote. I had two of my buddies from the engineering firm come over, and we spent the morning pouring a reinforced concrete base and bolting down a $3,000 solar-powered, smartphone-integrated boom gate right at the entrance of my driveway, 10 inches inside my legal property line. It was a beauty, powder-coated steel, a 12-foot arm with LED strips, and a license plate recognition camera that would only lift the arm for my truck and my son's bike. We just finished the calibration when the white Mercedes pulled up, and you could almost see the smoke coming out of Beverly's ears. She came charging out of her car, phone in hand, screaming that she was calling the sheriff, that this was a violation of every covenant in the book, but I just handed her a folder. In that folder was the city-approved permit for and quote, private security barrier, and quote, a copy of the survey showing the gate was entirely on my land, and a printout of the Texas Penal Code regarding, and quote, theft of services, and quote, and in quote, criminal trespass, and quote. I told her, and quote, Beverly, every time you parked here, you've been trespassing, and every time you used your HOA position to fine me as retaliation, you were violating the Fair Housing Act. I've already filed the paperwork with the State Real Estate Commission regarding your license, so if I were you, I'd get off my property before the arm comes down on your hood. End quote. She looked at that gate, then at me, and for the first time in 6 months, she was speechless. Her mouth just kind of worked up and down like a fish out of water, and she slunk back in her car and reversed so fast she clipped her own mailbox. The aftermath was like a slow-motion demolition of her life. Once the, end quote, tax fraud, end quote, words started floating around, the county actually did send an inspector, and it turns out she'd been underpaying by about $4,000 a year for nearly a decade. Plus the penalties were astronomical. The HOA board dissolved within a month, replaced by people like Mrs. Gable and a young couple from down the street who actually care about things like, end quote, community, end quote, instead of, end quote, control, end quote. Beverly had to put her house on the market to cover the legal fees and the back taxes, and the irony, the absolute delicious irony, was that she had to hire an outside firm to sell it because her own agency's reputation was so trashed in the area that nobody would sign with her. On her last day, as the movers were packing up that white Mercedes, I was out in my driveway, washing my truck. The boom gate was up, the sun was shining, and as she drove past, I just gave her a polite little wave. She didn't oppose. T waved back. But here's the thing that's been on my mind lately, and I want to know what you guys think about this. I won, right? The end quote, Karen, end quote, is gone. The neighborhood is peaceful, and I have my driveway back. But in the process, I became the guy with a commercial gate in a residential neighborhood. I became the guy who spent thousands of dollars and months of my life on a vendetta. And sometimes I look at that gate and I wonder, did I actually solve the problem? Or did I just build a better cage? I see people in the comments all the time talking about, end quote, pro-revenge, end quote, and end quote, satisfying endings, end quote. But when you're living it, the line between justice and obsession gets real thin, real fast. So, tell me, if you were in my shoes, if you had a neighbor who was systematically ruining your life and using their power to bully you, would you have gone as far as I did? Would you have dug into their taxes and their professional life? Or is there a point where the end quote, engineer and oppose, as solution, end quote, becomes just as toxic as the problem itself? I'm curious to see where you draw the line between standing your ground and burning the whole forest down just to catch one fox. Drop a comment below. Let's talk about it, because I've got a feeling I'm not the only one who's had to deal with a Beverly Vance. And hey, if you enjoyed this little trip into suburban warfare, hit that like button and subscribe. I've got plenty more stories from 25 years of watching things fall apart. And trust me, the structures people build for themselves are always the first things to crack. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.